Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. I'm so grateful to the committee and to the organizers, especially to Yolanda and to Carol for this extraordinary process. And a special shout out to Jamie and the whole team that's made this so smooth for all of us who are presenting and participating. On Tuesday, January 4th, 1854, 5 human beings were auctioned on the front steps of the DeKalb County Courthouse in downtown Decatur, Georgia. For white onlookers, this estate sale would have seemed routine and unremarkable, in keeping with the county's long-established practice of selling enslaved people connected to probate cases on the courthouse steps on the first Tuesday of each month. Yet for those being sold, the event must have seemed calamitous. As seen in this probate record, the adult woman Caroline and her infant child were purchased for $911 by James Payton, a local judge and farmer who owned the lands that 6 decades later would become the main campus of Emory University, where we're sitting today. Carolyn's 14-year-old daughter, Catherine, was sold to John Wesley Tumlin of Buckhead for $657. Carolyn's 2 sons, 11-year-old Jasper and 9-year-old Andy, were in turn purchased by Henry Irby, the founder of Buckhead, for $606 and $501, respectively. Tumlin and Irby took those children back to their plantation 7 miles away from here, but Caroline and her children were brought, and her child were brought here, and she must have feared she would never see her children again. Taking this auction as our point of departure, my remarks this afternoon explore the human costs of enslavement at Emory, both in Oxford, Georgia, where of course Emory College was founded in 1836, and on the antebellum plantations that subsequently became the main Atlanta campus of Emory University. But before examining these historical details, let's reflect a bit on the complex relationship between kinship, universities, and utopian space. The modern university emerges out of the institution of the medieval monastery, an ecclesiastical entity that recruited its members by breaking their previous biological familial ties to create an alternate mega family that reproduced itself without biological mating or biological birth. Like monasteries, university campuses are organized as utopian spaces behind the gates, that were called the mythic wonders of the Garden of Eden, recreating an ostensibly innocent moment before death and sin. Unlike medieval monks, our students are not asked to reject their birth parents, but they are separated for a time out from living with their families as they enter into the dream time of this latter-day paradise. Our faculty and students enter into a covenant that spans the generations, becoming part of an extended symbolic family in which the most important lineage is the transmission of knowledge and of university traditions. Yet this paradise, this oasis from the conventional world that in principle stands outside of normal commerce, normal families, has always rested upon the under-acknowledged work of many persons who have labored in the shadows. As the late community activist Emma Jean Williams told me and my students from Oxford College, as we toured the Oxford City Cemetery with her in 1999. She said, for the white founders of Emory, the college was a kind of paradise, their vision of what heaven was supposed to look like. But never forget, she said, that there were many others living and toiling in this county who lived on the other side of paradise. They built this town and this college going all the way back to slavery times. They are just as much a part of this place as anybody else. You just have to learn how to look, learn to see what's left behind, learn to hear what they are telling you after all these years. So my address today is dedicated to the memory of Miss Imogen and to the 2 other community elders whom we have lost this past terrible year. It's equally dedicated to the continuing struggle that Ms. Imogen committed to us to learn how to listen to the voices of the ancestors embedded in the landscapes of the 2 Emory campuses in Atlanta and in Oxford. Slavery, as many of you know, was woven into the daily fabric of life in the initial decades of Emory College, from its founding in the mid-1830s until it closed its doors in November 1861 for the duration of the Civil War. As you can see, most of the trustees, presidents, officers, and faculty were slave owners. Through collaborative work with the Oxford African American descendant community, some of them are represented here today, we've been able to identify by name over 80 women and men who were held in slavery in Oxford from 1836 until the end of the Civil War. And these names seen in the Civil War were read aloud last night very beautifully at the opening ceremony. Now, during times of slavery and freedom, these individuals and their descendants performed virtually all the basic labor upon which white faculty and students at Emory College depended, including agricultural work, cooking and food service, laundry and cleaning, groundskeeping, janitorial work, and caring for boarded students. Enslaved women were coerced, we now know, into sexual relationships and at times sexually assaulted, forced to mother, in some cases, the children of their white masters or white kin of their masters, knowing that these same children were destined for a life of bondage and could be taken from them without a moment's notice. And beyond that, an argument can be made that a primary ideological function of Emory College from its founding onwards was the legitimation and reproduction of the system of chattel slavery, as well as native removal, as we've heard this morning. These were processes upon which the entire economy, not just of the South, but of the Atlantic world depended. The school was named for Bishop John Emory, a slave owner and published critic of abolitionism, who had died in a carriage accident in 1835 and for whom the institutions felt enormous sympathy. The college's second president, Augustus Longstreet, owned 15 people in 1840 when he assumed the presidency. He was one of the South's most ardent and vituperative defenders of slavery, publishing tracts defending enslavement as biblically mandated and sanctified. Emory trained students who were committed to the natural propriety of owning human property and who struggled mightily to uphold the peculiar institution in times of peace and war. Key to this defense at a deeply Methodist institution was the sentimental narrative that white slave owners and their bondspeople of African descent constituted one extended family bound together through common faith and mutual affection. This is nicely illustrated by a headstone that Miss Imogen took us to, dating to 1856, 2 years after Carolyn was sold apart from her children near here. This reads, quote, "In memory of Mary, wife of Reverend Osborne Rogers, embraced religion August 12, 1812, died February 1856. The morning before her death, she called her family white and black around her and bade them farewell." Now, of course, in many instances, these metaphorical blood-like relations actually were biogenetic. It was a very complicated question what it meant to be part of the same family. And the historical record is replete of cases with slave owners in Newton County owning or selling their biological progeny and kin, even as they asserted sentimental bonds of family fidelity. The most famous of these narratives is Emory's history, the history of supposed loyalty between the enslaved and slave owners is the story of the woman known as Miss Kitty, who we now reference as Catherine Boyd. In standard white renditions, Bishop James Osgood Andrew, the first president of the Emory Board of Trustees, was a blameless slave owner who inherited Kitty when she was a girl, who was legally prohibited by the laws of Georgia from freeing her. Bishop Andrew, the standard white Southern narrative goes, was subsequently excoriated by hypocritical Northern bishops for his supposedly accidental slave ownership, leading to the national schism of the Methodist Church in 1844, which was a kind of dress rehearsal for the coming national disunion. White narratives repeated in hundreds of sources maintain that when offered transportation to Liberia in 1841, Miss Kitty refused. She chose to remain in Oxford out of loyalty to the bishop, and that then the bishop then supposedly set her up in her own little house to live with her free black husband Nathan and her children in virtual freedom. This sentimental account is, many of you know, enshrined in a large stone tablet erected in the 1930s in the Oxford cemeteries by white segregationists, including board members, a few yards away from Mary Rogers Stone. It commemorates the bonds of ostensibly respectful affection between Miss Kitty and her white owners, who arranged for her to be buried in the adjacent white Andrew family plot. And the whole story is told there. Now, the Kitty myth was further propagated in the 1930s when the white leaders of Emory arranged to transport the former slave quarters in which she and her children had resided to Salem Campground. And there it served for 6 decades as the Kitty Cottage Museum, a neo-Confederate memorial to the lost cause, deeply beloved by generations of white Southern Methodists. Now, for many generations, African Americans in Oxford have been deeply skeptical of this white narrative. They've maintained that Miss Kitty was coerced by the bishop into a long-term sexual relationship with him and that he fathered at least one of her children. They note as well that there's no evidence that Miss Kitty's husband, Nathan, was a free man, and they strongly suspect that he was rarely allowed to cohabit with his wife, Catherine. The supposed family loyalty felt by the white Andrews towards Miss Kitty certainly did not extend to honoring the bonds between her 3 surviving children and their black father, the enslaved man, who we now know was Nathan Boyd. After MissKitty's death in Oxford in 1851, Bishop Andrew moved his household, including Catherine Boyd's 3 children, Alfred, Russell, Nathan, and Emma, to Summerfield, Alabama, just north of Selma. When we look at his Freedmen's Bank record from 1871, we can see that even 20 years after his death, he lists his wife as Catherine dead and the children Alfred, Nathan, and Emma L. There's a tragic story of Nathan's own youth. At 13 years old, he'd been separated from his parents after his owner, Reverend Shell, in Newberry, South Carolina, died. His family was broken apart, and he endured really multiple separations, we can see, from his loved ones and even from his own children. So whenever I hear the sentimental narrative, which you can read in hundreds of places, as I say, recounting that the story of Kitty, we've just lost the visual there. Sorry. Claiming that she was, quote, just like a member of the family, my mind goes to the poignant predicament of Nathan Boyd in Atlanta 5 years after emancipation, still listing his late spouse Catherine as lost children, never knowing their fate up until he died in 1875 and was buried in a pauper's grave not so far away from here in Oakland Cemetery. We have other examples of Bishop Andrew breaking apart the so-called the Greenwood slaves, about 18 people who formed several family groups who were broken apart again in the 1850s, not to see one another again for a long time. Another form of violated family integrity is witnessed in a stone marker near the Kitty tablet on the African-American side of the Oxford Cemetery. One stone honors Louisa, as you can see. She's listed as the faithful servant of G.W.W. Stone, who was professor of mathematics at Emory College. As an enslaved woman, she raised nearly all of Professor Stone's children across the decades. Now, his son, Professor Stone's son, wrote, she couldn't have loved her own children any more than she did us, and we loved her just like she was kin to us. And he writes contemptuously of her husband, Sam Means, who became, after the war, quote, too free. The other side, though, is fascinating and tells us something extremely interesting. It's carved in a different hand, we can see of the headstone, and it commemorates her as Louisa Means. And descendants have explained that some months after the Whitestone family honored Louisa as the servant of Professor Stone, her own family surreptitiously chiseled this alternate name, her full married name, signaling her marriage to Sam Means, who'd been enslaved by Alexander Means, who was professor of natural sciences and president of the college. Even in death, her relatives mourned. She'd been separated from her family by the white authored original wording of this headstone, which grafted her into the white family's sentimental economy without acknowledging her own black family ties. And Sam himself, by the way, was often rented out all over the county, had very little, was not able to see his wife and children, except under special circumstances. Other enslaved people in Dr. Means's household were even in a more precarious position. Early on in the Civil War, Henry Robinson, enslaved by Professor Means, was sent off to the front, attached as a slave to Dr. Means's son, Thomas Alexander Means, who served in the Confederate Army. Now, Henry returns home to Oxford in November of 1861. He's actually participated in the Battle of Manassas, a Confederate victory, but only to discover that rather than being thanked for his service in saving the professor's son's life, he's actually been sold by Dr. Means, along with his wife, Millie, and his 3 children, Thomas, Troop, and Mildred, to Judge Reynolds, who was in Covington. He fought back, and there's a fascinating account in the Rose Library, and Dr. Means's diary that Henry is much distressed, unwilling to go. The women especially argue that Alexander Means becomes infuriated with the adult daughter, Mildred, and insists on selling her, though he releases the others from the contract. And she leaves with her young child. She's immediately then taken away from the judge's house, given as a dowry gift to his son-in-law. She does survive the war and eventually finds her way back to Oxford, but her young child has died during all this terrible movement. Now, these narratives of family history linger over, and here we come to the other side of this symposium, over the African-American historical memory, because they're intertwined with the circumstances of land alienation and the forced dispossession of indigenous people from local lands. So Cornelius Robinson, who was also owned as the valet of Professor Alexander Means, and Angeline Sims, who was owned by Richard Sims, a founding member of the Emory Board of Trustees, were both Muskogee Creek, their descendants maintain. They were separated from their indigenous kin and enslaved. But interestingly enough, a small community of Angeline's collateral descendants, their ancestors were called, continue to live along the Alcovy River in Newton County and to find themselves as Indian well into the 20th century. Here, of course, we see the famous map. And Angeline's, one of Angelina's many descendants, John P. Godfrey, J.P. Godfrey, remembered that as late as the 1940s, as a child, he was taken to see his native kin along the river. The distant trauma of this sort of history of forced indigenous population removal is illustrated in many places, including the very name of the geographical feature that runs just a quarter mile alongside of Oxford College, and that's known as Dried Indian Creek. Now, there's a white narrative that claims that this was a name because there was a mummified remains that were found by early white settlers, but African-American descendants insist there's a different version. A Native American leader refused to leave the land his people had inhabited since time immemorial. As punishment, the initial white settlers, it is said, hanged him from a tree over that creek, refused to allow anyone to cut him down until his remains were dried out. And there are many powerful commentaries in the community about this. Deacon Forrest Sawyer Jr., who'd been an SCLC field secretary, recalls, this county was founded with an act of murder. They were demonstrating the price that would be paid by anyone, red or black, who dared oppose them. Emma Jean Williams said, these are the things. This is how they kept power in this county, through public demonstrations of violence, going all the way back to Dried Indian Creek. Lynchings, public executions of black men, scheduled as black people, as black people were filing back to go to church on Sunday. And Mr. Godfrey remarked, I just don't think it was entirely coincidental that Emory was founded right in the shadow of where that Indian chief was murdered so long ago. They wanted to show that they had taken hold of this land and what would happen to anyone who opposed them. Many members of the community, many elders connected this to the killing at Dried Indian Creek with the 1946 mass lynching of two young African couples by 15 Klansmen nearby Walton County, a terrible story. Again, Forrest Sawyer said, I wanted to make the point that it's not surprising that all of these horrible things happened along rivers, because that's exactly what happened at the Morris Ford lynching. Rivers, he said, are the lifeblood, the arteries of our land here. Rivers and streams were sacred for Indians, and it was those same creeks we'd steal away to feel the flow of the Holy Spirit from the day we were brought to this county in chains. Of course, white folks chose to torture and kill our people along the riverbank, reminding them that nothing was sacred. Any bond of family, any tie of love could be broken in a moment. That's what white power was back then, and it still is. So as we were talking about this morning, for these descendants who understand their line of descent as going back to enslaved people of African descent, and also back to Creek relations, to Native relations, the story of the disenfranchisement, the decitizenship of the Creek freedmen has been particularly painful. J.P. Godfrey himself said, so many thousands gone. We had hoped our kin, though in bondage to the Creek, would have finally found safe harbor in Oklahoma, but now we hear they were expelled, referencing the constitutional change, for having a drop of black blood. For our folks, you might say, the trail of tears has never ended. Now let's return to the grounds here of the slavery-based plantations that house the main Emory University campus, shown here in overlay maps. It's a little complicated, but essentially 5 plantations make up the modern main campus. So the 1860 slave schedule indicates that Judge James Payton, who purchased Carolyn in 1854, the Decatur courthouse, owned about 20 enslaved people, as you can see, held in 3 slave quarters, evidently where the Goizeta Business School now stands. One of these buildings held the family of Jerry and Grace, who took the surname Payton after emancipation. And we know from various records, including wills, at the Rose Library. The Jerry and Grace saw at least 3 of their daughters taken away from them in the 1850s and 1860s. At some point prior to 1859, Sarah, who we see here, was sent 700 miles away to East Texas as a wedding gift for the judge's daughter, Elizabeth Payton Chandler. Rose was taken away from her family and given to Judge Payton's daughter, Carolyn Payton Strange, who lived up about 50 miles up in Cass County. And then a few years later, the youngest girl in 1861, Lucy, was separated from her parents and given as a gift to Thomas and Oatman Payton when she was 7 years old then. That was the eldest son of Judge James Payton, and his land is sort of familiar to us along the area that's now the Briarcliff campus. And then in January 1865, there's a much larger distribution. Here we have Lucy, the receipt for Lucy. Here we have the probate documents showing that all these interlinked families being divided up right here. And perhaps the most poignant of these divisions, as you can see, is the case of 5-year-old Henry, who was distributed to the judge's daughter, Jane Sapphire Payton, and her husband, Edwin Harrison Guess. So Henry's mother, Dina, and her infant child were distributed like their cousin, Sarah, to Elizabeth Payton Chandler, 700 miles away in Texas. So mother and son, little Henry, must have feared he would never see his mother again. Now, these families were linked to many other cases of families traumatized by their own family separations. Adlecta Payton, it's a little hard to see here, but grew up on the Payton place. She married Aaron Houseworth, a well-known Houseworth family in Avondale Estates. His family, his father, Daniel, who's a skilled blacksmith, had been auctioned from the Covington Courthouse near Emory, from those steps in January 1852, and it was purchased from the estate of William Warren, a family that's actually long connected to many members of the Emory board. And Daniel was sold apart, as this document shows us, from his 17-year-old wife, Millie Ann, and her infant child, who presumably was his offspring. So far as we know, Daniel, who was taken to the Philip Houseworth plantation here in DeKalb County, never saw his wife, Millie Ann, and young child again. Well, we can go on with many of these stories, but at the same point, as we sort of take a breath and honor all of these lost and divided families, it is important as we sort of move, again, here's this story of division, that we remember and recognize the resilience and courage of these extraordinary families who endured so much injustice and anguish across the generations. Many of the individuals we've discussed today did in fact manage, not all, but many against overwhelming odds, to locate one another and reunite after emancipation. And here, I'd really like in this spirit to acknowledge the brilliant painting of The Spirit of Emancipation by artist Raymond Cody, who I believe is here today. If you could stand and be acknowledged. As you can see, a newly liberated woman arcs her back in exultation. It's so wonderful we have the painting here today, uttering perhaps a ring shout. The accumulated marks of the lash on her back, hundreds of them, seem to fly off her body. It's almost as if they leap off the canvas. She's transmuted perhaps from flesh into spirit, filled with a new spirit of joy and determination. It's as if perhaps she's given birth, not only to her new self, but to an entire people. Perhaps each flying lash mark is being transformed into her progeny, peopling a new nation born in freedom. And that spirit we see, for example, coming back to Carolyn, with whom we started. She's sold away from her 3 children on the county courthouse steps in January 1854, 3 miles away, and then she's brought right here to the lands that became Emory. We have documents that show her, let me just go back for a moment. Sorry, here she is. She's living 5 years later after emancipation in Buckhead. She is close by her own parents, who she's reconnected with. She's found her 3 children, Catherine, Jasper, and Andy. They're all married with children of her own. And Lucy Payton, remember the 7-year-old girl who was taken away from her parents, finds 5 years later, she's back living with her parents, Jerry and Grace. They've gotten out of sharecropping. They're now living in downtown Atlanta. And so she actually soon after marries. She's one of the first free Black weddings in Atlanta's Mount Zion Baptist Church, one of the city's oldest Black-led congregations. Dina, who had lost Henry, remember, it's quite remarkable. By 1880, we don't know quite how this happened. They've all found each other again. There's Dina living, and she's residing back in downtown Atlanta with Henry, who's now a worker with the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railway. Cornelius Robinson, who recall had been divided as a child from his Creek relatives, his Muskogee relatives must have been did endure. He continues to work for Alexander Means. He and his wife Ellen Robinson married. Their daughter married Sarah, who married who married Robert. Well, he became Robert Anderson, the son of Thomas Anderson, who had been enslaved by Bishop Andrew, and their son becomes the famous Henry Billy Mitchell, the very beloved groundskeeper at Oxford College for many decades. In turn, Angelina, who we recall, also of Muskogee background, she presumably never saw her indigenous relatives again, but she is also an honored matriarch, and nearly all of the 13 families of Oxford trace their descent back to her and her daughters Minerva and Sally and others. Minerva's great-great-grandson is Mr. Anderson Wright, who's president of the Oxford Cemetery Association and steward at Rust Chapel United Methodist Church. He's a leading figure in the Oxford community, an invaluable partner in all this work, and I am delighted that Mr. Wright is here today, if you could also be recognized. And also joining us is a descendant of Angelina's daughter, Minerva, Eva Henderson, a remarkable woman who's now 90, couldn't be with us today. She worked in food service at Oxford College for a long time, continuing a long tradition of involvement with the college that stretches back really 2 centuries. And we are so thrilled that her family is represented by her niece, Shirley Reese. Shirley, if you could stand as well. Thank you. And also connected to us by Zoom, we told the story of Daniel, remember, who was the blacksmith who was sold from the courthouse steps in Covington again in 1852. And his great-great-grandson, Mr. Clarence Burton in Detroit, is zooming in today and is with us virtually as well. Finally is the extraordinary story of the descendants of MissKitty, or Catherine Boyd, and Nathan Boyd. Their second son, Russell Nathan Boyd, those of you who've read my book may remember the story, became in Washington. He sort of made his way north to Washington, D.C. He became a librarian at the U.S. Department of State, was the keeper, among other things, of the Declaration of Independence. Their firstborn son, Alfred Boyd, liberated himself in April '65 from Bishop Andrew's plantation in Alabama. He attached himself to the 3rd Iowa Cavalry of the Union Army, made his way north to Keosauqua, Iowa, became an ordained minister of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and served with distinction in churches in Iowa and Illinois. I had the privilege of meeting his great-grandson, Lee Caldwell, trustee at Allen Chapel, AME, an institution that Reverend Alfred had himself pastored, and we're absolutely thrilled. And this always seems miraculous and wonderful that Lee's daughter, Cynthia MissKitty's great-great-great-granddaughter, is here with us in the audience this afternoon, representing this remarkable family. And her sister, Darcel, who couldn't be here today, I believe is joining us by Zoom. All right, so where are we on this? I mean, this university, like so many others, bears the trace of our nation's intertwined founding sins: the expropriation and population assaults against indigenous peoples, and the enslavement of persons of African descent. The lands on which the Atlanta and Oxford campuses rest bear the traces of the structural violence committed against these families in slavery and in freedom. These lands still register the long accumulated toll of violated bonds of kinship and of love. So this symposium, at the end of the day, this is something I know that Yolanda and Carol keep on emphasizing, is devoted to the question of how do we move forward? How do we heal these wounds? How do we move beyond a mythic fantasy that the university was always an extended family, a fantasy that tends to efface subaltern workers of color in slavery and post-slavery? How do we recover a deeper sense of kinship that encompasses reciprocal bonds of mutual responsibility and accountability for all who have studied, labored, and taught on these grounds, as we ponder what appropriate reparations might look like in terms of perhaps extensive scholarships, collaborative investment in low-income African-American descendant communities, enduring partnerships, on health or art or so many other things that could link us together, sociality should guide our efforts. Human costs of the long history and its aftermath. We need to listen to the blood that still cries out from the earth. True, it's sort of like the lash marks upon Raymond Cody's painting, that these wounds perhaps might be transmuted. They might be reconstituted as the progeny of a new nation, a new national family conceived in liberty. Because true kinship, after all, is only reconstituted out of an honest recognition of legacies of pain, when we honor in the fullest way possible the stories, the names, and the contributions of those who were held in bondage, of those who saw their land taken from them. In listening to the stories this land has to tell us, all of us may jointly participate in a profound and continuing homecoming dedicated to doing justice, to healing what Mrs. Emma Jean Williams termed the other side of paradise. In so doing, may we all act as true kin to one another, collectively ushering in the beloved community that is the common birthright of all humankind. Thank you. And now we're going to try to move back and forth between the two planes of existence. So please bear with us. And Megan is going to try to let us know. Do we have a question that's come in from the audience yet? Not yet. So we'll begin. If we could just ask you to come forward to the microphone so that Zoom and the recording process can pick up your question or your reflection or your comment.
There is a question.
All right.
About the name of your book, and it's available for Christmas.
Right. So my first book that was referenced is called The Accidental Slave Owner, which is an ironic title because Bishop Andrew always claimed he was only an accidental slave owner. So The Accidental Slave Owner, the subtitle is Revisiting a Myth of Race and Finding an American Family. It was published by in 2011 by University of Georgia Press and is available. Oh my gosh. And you actually have it. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Mark, what drives your passion toward not just doing the research, but finding these answers? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, obviously, there's a degree of obsession here. I mean, I suppose, though, that, I mean, what really drove me initially in this work was my students at Oxford College. This was, we did a lot of this early work right after 9/11, and many of our students of color, many of our Muslim students felt particularly at risk, and there was an enormous coming together on the college of students who wanted to work together and do a project that was significant. They were aware that there was a profound injustice in Emory, issues of environmental racism, a failure to desegregate the police department, but also the failure to desegregate the cemetery, and that sort of drove us in. So we started to do a community engaged research project, and it became clear that so many of the issues to do with the risks of over-policing, with the issues every day that students were encountering in the residence halls, even in classes, or when they went into Oxford and Covington, could not be disentangled from this long history, so that drove me initially. I think there are probably other motivations. I mean, I lost much of my family in the Holocaust, and I think that communicates a certain sense of the importance of naming names, of honoring those who were lost, of honoring lives lived in the shadows. And I think for this, but at the end of the day, what's kept me going is this extraordinary community that's represented here today, the Oxford African-American descendant community that has welcomed me and my wife now for 25 years into their circle. We've worshiped with them. We've gone through moments of great joy and sadness together. And it's that sense of joint commitment, which is now extended to your remarkable family, that I think keeps me going when it seems tough. And now the work, as you've sort of gathered, has transitioned from thinking about Emory College in its early days, the Oxford part, and the second book project now is very much about the story of enslaved people who live lives on the five plantations that became the main Emory University campus. So that's the new work that I'm trying to complete.
The questions are now streaming in.
Okay. I'll trust you.
We have a question from Molly McKee from Oxford College. It says, thank you for your work and for your talk today. How do you envision this history be best made public to audiences and marked on Emory's landscapes? And how do you think students could be involved in such work?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Molly does wonderful work with the student body. I know there's an ongoing memorial process that Emma Jean's daughter, Reverend Avis Williams, is even part of the committee, and I'm sure wonderful designs will be developed. But I love that idea of the more we can involve students, and I would hope also young people in Newton County and in Atlanta, especially those from sort of at-risk backgrounds. I would love to see a history corps of young people, maybe our undergraduates paired with community members from not only Newton County, but maybe Greene and Putnam County, deeply impoverished counties that the university has a long historical connection with, and have them become interpreters, giving tours, doing research. And, as we hope will be scholarships someday, that those would be the sort of vanguard of young people that would come and really keep this history alive, because ultimately it is about empowering our young people. I mean, I say this as a teacher, but I think we all feel that in these perilous and strange days that we live on as teachers, we are given our greatest faith, our greatest hope by what happens in the classroom, seeing what the extraordinary activism and scholarship our students are doing. And that, I think, is the most important living monument. I want to see physical memorials, but the most important living memorial is the work, is the lives and the development of our students.
Great, thank you. And if you could repeat the questions that I said.
Oh, yes, sorry.
On Zoom, they're having trouble hearing me.
Okay.
So this question comes from Laura Wilson. You found so much documentation regarding sales of enslaved. These types of documents would be enormously helpful for African Americans during their own genealogy. Can you tell us a bit about the process of locating actual sales documents in the
Let's see. So Laura herself has done important work. She's often so the question was, how do we find these documents? And I think also, how do we archive them and make them more accessible through, for example, the DCAB History Center and the Rose Library and so forth. So a lot of the records that I drew on today that we looked at are from probate records. And county deed records. So those are found in the DeKalb County Courthouse in the real estate and records and probate records. Some of those, fortunately, have been digitized by Family Search, the LDS organization, so are accessible. But I think you're right, and that seems to be another important thing that Emory and the consortium of universities studying slavery can do more of, using the tools we have of scholarship and the extraordinary, the groundbreaking work at the Emory Center for Digital Scholarship, which is unparalleled, doing more to sort of democratize that knowledge, I think, as Laura's suggesting, to make these documents as accessible to families all over the country, all over the world. That's a wonderful idea. And I hope our students can be involved in that process, partnering with the library teams.
There, a live question.
Sure. Yes. Oh, absolutely. We're doing okay.
Hello. My name is Mimi Kaiser, and I'm recently retired from the School of Public Health here as faculty. And thank you for your obsession. And thank you for the relationships that you've built along the way in that obsession. I really think that's critical. I want to just offer some reflection on my experience at Emory, and one in particular was that this is related to the institution in terms of like faculty and staff, and that I participated in the Transforming Community Project, which I hear people are talking about now. But one thing that happened in that was looking at some of this history together across differences and building relationships and the understanding of that history. And it was really transformative for me. And the way that it brought different levels of people across faculty and staff together. But the heart of it really was kind of coming into that truth together in relationships. It was indeed very transformative. So I guess it's not a question, but just a comment on the nature of the relationships that are here in the room through your work, and also the possibilities of Emory further nurturing that kind of thing, grounded in this history and knowing it together.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautifully expressed. I do think that, and that was a wonderful aspect of the TCP undertaking, that realization that what it was really about was not just checking off boxes, but actually all of us emerging into another state through building community in the deepest, most profound sense of that term. I think, and it did mean going into a sort of shared wellspring of pain and understanding that each one of these documents gets read differently, as it does by everyone in this room, sometimes with a twinge of regret, and others it just pierces the soul. And to learn how to sit with one another, begin to listen, and I think especially at this particular strange juncture in American history, where the entire American experiment now seems up for grabs, when basic principles of civility, when white nationalism seems resurgent, that's the only antidote that we have ultimately are those kinds of deeply personally meaningful relationships, learning to recognize the I and the thou, every day, every person, one at a time, and then beginning to build out from that. And that, I think, is the most important aspect of this book. I mean, of course, I like writing this work. I like writing books, but at the end of the day, I think you're right. It is that long, slow, gradual process, what some would call the experience of grace, that makes this ultimately worthwhile and gives us hope for a future for the nation and perhaps for the whole world. Yes.
Thank you so much. I think we are out of time. There are more questions. Thank you to everyone who participated.
Great. And can we save those? Is that okay?
I think we can save them.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you, everybody.